Welcome to the Knight and Rose Show, where we discuss practical ways of living out an authentic Christian worldview. I'm Wintery Knight.
And I'm Desert Rose. Today, we are diving into a topic that is often confusing, sometimes divisive, but incredibly important. And that is, how should Christians think about the environment, energy, and climate? Not from fear or political ideology, but based on truth and evidence. And to help us navigate that conversation, I am thrilled to welcome Dr. E. Calvin Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, and one of the most thoughtful Christian voices on environmental ethics, economics, energy policy, and stewardship. Dr. Beisner has written extensively on climate change, natural law, economics, topics that you all know are important to us. And he's written on what faithful dominion looks like in a fallen world. So, Dr. Beisner, welcome to the show. It is such an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Rose, and Winter as well. Thank you. It's my privilege.
Well, let me get started with a foundational question. How does Scripture, and perhaps even natural law, teach us to understand human dominion and stewardship? And maybe also, where do modern environmental movements go wrong on this?
Yeah, that's a tremendous question. It's a question that a lot of Christians approaching this forget to ask. They'll move immediately to empirical questions about, how rapidly are species going extinct? How much has the world warmed up over the last 100 years? How much is it likely to warm up in the next 50, etc.? Those empirical questions, actually, how we answer them can depend on the worldview with which we approach, because that worldview might force us to think about the way the creation works a little differently from how, say, a secularist or a pantheist might do. So basically, the environmental movement as a whole tends to be rooted in one of two basic worldviews: a materialist, secularist worldview in which matter and energy is all there is, and that's nature, right? And everything has to fit in that way. Or a pantheistic, or perhaps panentheistic, or even animistic worldview. Pantheism, God is everything. Panentheism, God is to the universe as the soul is to the body. Animism, spiritism, there are lots of little gods or spirits that inhabit rocks and trees and rivers and mountains and so on. But in either of those cases, we start right off with a most fundamental biblical error. And that is the error of denying the creator-creature distinction. The Apostle Paul, of course, tells us in Romans chapter 1 how that comes about and what results from that. Professing themselves to become wise, men become fools, and God gives them over to a depraved mind. And that leads to all kinds of problems in thinking about theology, about the world itself, about ethics and sexuality, and on and on. So it's very important that we approach these issues from a biblical worldview that tells us that an infinite, eternal, unchangeable, rational God designed an ordered universe and placed in it human beings made in his image to be rational as he is, to understand it the way he's made it, and then to exercise, as you mentioned in introducing me, dominion over it. That is to be able to use it in a way that glorifies God. So that's sort of the beginning. We could go into a whole lot more detail. We actually offer a small booklet through our online store called The Competing Worldviews of Environmentalism and Christianity. And actually, as a special favor to your listeners, anyone who, by the end of January of 2026, requests that when making a donation at cornwallalliance.org, if they request Competing Worldviews or just Worldviews, we'll send a free copy of that booklet.
Excellent. Oh, I love that. I would certainly encourage our listeners to take advantage of that offer. That is great. A lot of people assume that the planet is extremely fragile. What do they misunderstand about the resilience of Earth's climate and ecosystems? And how should we interpret things like natural disasters and extreme weather in light of history?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can approach that, for one thing, from scientific perspective, a sort of a basic physics and basic geology, et cetera, perspective, atmospheric science, oceanographic science. They all involve what is called Le Chatelier's principle. That's the principle that any natural system that is roughly in equilibrium — there is no such thing as any natural system that is in perfect equilibrium, but a natural system that is in near equilibrium, if something pushes that out of equilibrium, you get some sort of a major influence on it that has not been around for a long time, that system will naturally trend back toward its equilibrium. That's how every natural system we've ever been able to study works. But the assumption that our climate system, when we add, well, we've raised carbon dioxide concentration in the climate system by a little over 50% since before the Industrial Revolution. That sounds like a whole lot, but it's actually moving from about 27 thousandths of 1% to, at this point, 43 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. But we're told that that's going to cause some sort of really catastrophic warming. That doesn't fit well with Le Chatelier's principle. Now, as Christians, we can also approach this in biblical terms, even starting just with the very simple declaration in Genesis 1:31, after God has created everything, including man and woman in his image, he sees it all, and behold, it is very good.
Yes.
Now, let me ask you a question. Suppose that I were an architect, and I designed a building so that if somebody leaned against a wall, all of the feedback mechanisms of that building in terms of its structure would multiply the stress of my body weight, which is more than it should be, by the way, but would multiply that stress over and over and over again until the entire building collapsed. Would you say that was good design or bad design?
Bad design, not very good.
Yeah, it wouldn't fit really well with, and behold, it was very good.
Exactly.
Well, we're being asked to think that Earth's climate system is like that building, such that even a fairly slight perturbation on it causes it to go into catastrophic warming. That doesn't make much sense from a biblical perspective. It doesn't make so much sense in terms of Le Chatelier's principle. Mm-hmm. And frankly, it's countered by everything that we observe. We've added a little over 50% carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the last couple hundred years. But that we've only seen about 1.2 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature, which, by the way, is no more than has happened in repeated warmings in the past, and which brought us up out of the Little Ice Age, which was a period of real suffering for mankind. Cold is much worse than heat for human beings and for pretty much all life on Earth. And so we should be thankful for that rather than protesting in the streets.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was just thinking in my head, I wonder if you'll talk about the medieval warming period as an example of the Earth being much warmer without all of these carbon emissions. I don't know if you just want to say a brief word about that.
Yeah, the medieval warm period probably lasted from roughly 950 to 1250 AD. And what we saw, or what we can extrapolate from proxy temperature measures from that period, as well as actually from historical writings of the period, even from artwork, what we saw was a period that was significantly warmer than the prior period and significantly warmer than the following period, the Little Ice Age, that ran from about 1350 to about 1850. It was probably about the same global average temperature as today, if not a little bit warmer than today. And what we learn from history is that Crops grow better in warmer weather than in colder weather, and that means people have more food to eat. It was during the Little Ice Age that, frankly, near starvation diets for millions of people all over the world made them far more vulnerable to the plague and other diseases than they would have been had they had enough food. That's why Europe lost almost a third of its population during the Great Plague of the Little Ice Age. So we should be very grateful that we've come out of the Little Ice Age. I'm not saying that human activity doesn't contribute to warming. I think that it does, but certainly not in any catastrophic way.
Very good. So let's keep that focus on the needs of people and turn to the topic of energy. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that abundant, affordable energy is so essential to human flourishing, especially for the poor?
Well, once upon a time, back in the Dark Ages or when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, people learned in middle school that the definition of energy to a physicist is the capacity to do work. All right?
Okay.
Now, that's really important to grasp because, simple as it may sound, it has tremendous implications. We have to do work to grow and harvest and refine and cook and serve food, and to make clothing, and to build housing and industry and everything else. Everything that we do, food, clothing, shelter, communication, transportation, medical care, everything depends on energy. The more energy you can apply, the more work you can get done. The more work you can get done, the more of all of those things you can have. And that energy has to be not only in great quantity, but also affordable. And it has to be reliable. It has to be not something that comes when it wants to, but not necessarily when you want it to. So what we see very, very clearly is a nearly 99% correlation between gigawatt hours of electricity consumed or joules of energy from fuel in cars and trucks and ships and the like. We see a near on to 99% correlation between energy consumed and gross domestic product per capita. That is the most basic general description of wealth. The more energy people use, the wealthier they tend to be. And in the climate debate, that's really important because wealth is far more important to human well-being than climate. If you have income equivalent to the bottom fifth of Americans, you can thrive in any climate from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Brazilian rainforest. But if you're trying to get by on the UN's definition of extreme poverty, roughly $2 per capita per day, you can't thrive in the best tropical paradise. So overcoming poverty, staying out of poverty, is far more important to human health and well-being than anything about trying to control, trying to fix climate. In fact, wealth allows us to protect ourselves from climate and other natural disasters. Over the last 100 years, average human mortality per year has fallen by over 99%. Over 99%. And that's during the very period in which we've had the global warming that we're being told is a disaster. I think those two claims don't go together real well.
Yeah, I think I've seen that in reading Thomas Sowell books where he talks about the effect of a natural disaster in Haiti compared to America, where they're just so poor that it does massive amounts of damage there.
Exactly.
Whereas here we have, working highways where we can move resources. We can have helicopters. We can fly in all kinds of trained people who have gone to, university to learn how to be paramedics and doctors.
Yes. And
it just doesn't have the same impact. And that's largely because we have a different kind of economy and a different standard of living than they do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Exactly.
Let's shift to the scientific data now. Given the range of scientific projections about future climate change, what do you believe is the most likely scenario we're facing over the next several decades? And also, what practical impacts, positive and negative, do you expect?
Well, in a big fat book that I co-edited with Dr. David R. Legates, he is our Director of Research and Education, retired longtime professor of climatology at the University of Delaware. There you go. You're holding it up in front of me. Right. In that, I just write, life after climate change is going to be better than before. And a lot of people will say, oh, that's crazy. I mean, that's against all the experts. No, it's not. It is exactly what the real experts are telling us. The climate alarmists try to claim that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the world's most authoritative body on climate change. There are ways in which I might agree with that if you're really looking only at the very technical scientific stuff that they put out. I would certainly disagree with it if you're looking at the summaries for policymakers that get written by the political appointees and thoroughly misrepresent the scientific reports. But in one of their scientific reports, the 2018 Special Report on Global Warming of 1.8 degrees Celsius, along about, I think it's page 454 out of that report, they say that if we were to do absolutely nothing to slow climate change from 2018 to the end of the century, the result would be about, I'm trying to pull this number out of my head again, but I believe it would be 2.66 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature. And then they say that the effect of that on gross world product, the total amount of wealth created each year, would be to reduce gross world product by 2.6%. Now, some people will see that and they'll say, oh no, so we lose 2.6% of gross world product. That's a terrible thing. But the problem is that they're not thinking about what happens between now and then. At the very same time that temperature is increasing, gross world product is increasing. Through the 20th century, it increased on average 3% per year. There's no reason to think it's going to increase more slowly during the 21st century. As a matter of fact, AI gives us reasons to think it'll probably increase a whole lot more rapidly. Actually, if you take the predicted 3% per year increase in gross world product, and you apply that to the UN's estimate of what population will be at the end of the century, and then you reduce that gross world product by 2.6%, the average Earthling in 2100 will be approximately 8.9 times wealthier. That is, will be producing approximately 8.9 times as much every year as the average Earthling was in 2018. Now, that doesn't sound like catastrophe to me. And so that's part of why I say, no, life after climate change will be significantly better than it was before. I think we can expect probably, another 0.5 to 1 degree of increase in global average temperature. That's less than the UN expects. But I think that's more in line with empirical measures instead of just relying on climate models, which consistently overstate the warming that we actually observe. But even if it goes to the couple of degrees added temperature, even the UN says it's going to be just fine.
Yeah. So kind of in summary, longer growing seasons and more food and
yes.
More plant life and fewer cold-related deaths. Right.
Intense cold kills about 20 times as many people per day as intense heat does. Now, furthermore, the warming from greenhouse gases happens mostly toward the poles, mostly in the winter, mostly at night. In other words, it raises very, very low temperatures. But it doesn't happen toward the equator in the summer in the daytime. So it doesn't raise high temperatures. So we won't see an increase in the frequency or intensity of heat waves, but we will see a decrease in the intensity and frequency of cold snaps, which means we see a huge decrease in the number of temperature-related deaths.
Wow. Yeah.
Awesome. Before we go on, I just want to give a plug to your book. This book, Climate and Energy, The Case for Realism,
Yes.
by you and David Legate. I don't know how to pronounce. Is that correct?
You got it.
Yeah,
Yes.
I like to buy one book on every topic. I mean, Rose and I are majoring in Christian apologetics, evidential apologetics, but we like to know a little about education policy, healthcare policy,
Sure.
climate and energy policy, one or two books in every area. And this is the book that I would recommend to people. This collection of essays is excellent coverage of what you would typically bring up when you're applying Christian convictions to these particular areas. It's really well done.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. And I will make the same offer for that to your listeners.
Okay.
If they want a copy of that as our way of saying thank you when somebody gives a gift at cornwallalliance.org/donate of any amount, if they request climate and energy, we will send them a free copy of that.
Excellent. Wow. And that's like a $35 book, you guys. So, and it's huge. Yeah. It's packed full of information and outstanding. So good.
The offer goes to the end of January of 2026, by the way.
Okay. Excellent. So based on the likelihood of, a 2.5 degrees warming or such, what do you believe a prudent, measured, ethically responsible climate strategy should look like for policymakers and for Christians concerned about stewardship?
Well, for those living in already well-developed countries, I would say we don't need to do anything for ourselves. We're all thoroughly capable of handling anything that climate and weather throw at us. Mm-hmm. But for people living in developing countries, in the poorest countries in the world, what they need far more than anything related to trying to slow, stop, or reverse global warming, which I think would just be unwise anyway, but what they need far more than anything related to that is economic development, economic growth. Mm-hmm. And at the Cornwall Alliance, we've done a lot of study on that. Rose, I think you've read my book, Prosperity and Poverty, The Compassionate Use of Resources in a World of Scarcity. And
one of my favorite books, by the way. Phenomenal book.
Thank you so much. One of the things that I argued in that, and I gave, I think, a great deal of solid data to support this, is that there are 5 social institutions that are indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty. Those are private property rights, entrepreneurship, free trade, limited government, and the rule of law. Basically what we call free market economics, what Marx dubbed capitalism. It was a pejorative term for him, but frankly, I will be glad to embrace it because without capital, you can't do anything. But right. We need those 5 institutions, but we also need one material factor that's indispensable to rising and staying out of poverty. We mentioned it before, and that is access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of wealthy Western countries dominated by environmentalists who have grossly exaggerated the risks and underestimated or ignored the benefits of climate change. These countries have impressed on developing countries obligations to try to use so-called renewable or green energy, solar and wind primarily, instead of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The result has been to slow or stop their rise out of poverty, and because of that, to slow or stop their reduction of weather-related, climate-related, and all other things-related deaths. Because quite simply, wealthier people can afford a clean, healthful, beautiful environment better than poorer people can, and a clean, healthful, and beautiful environment is a costly good. If you want to have that, you need to want people to get wealthy. But that means you have to stop slowing their economic growth by demanding the substitution of unreliable, because intermittent, wind and solar, expensive because you start with a very, very low density energy source and have to try to ramp it up to usable density, and frankly, not abundant energy source because it's not equally sunny or windy all over the world. Fossil fuels are extremely abundant. They are far less expensive per gigawatt hour or other measure of energy produced, and they are reliable. We know when they can work. We can store them on site and so on. So we need to stop what my friend Vijay Jayaraj, who is an Indian climate scientist and wonderful Christian, he, I think, was the one who coined the term climate colonialism. We need to stop that and invite the rest of the world to grow out of poverty as we've done.
Excellent. Yeah, definitely. Many people assume that supporting aggressive climate policy automatically equals morality. From an ethical standpoint, what are some of the morally problematic climate policies that are being enacted? You mentioned, eco-colonialism, harming the poor. That seems like a serious one that people need to know about.
Yeah. Well, as a former professor of ethics in seminary, I might start with this. Good ethics starts with telling the truth, not lying, and not being sloppy and careless with your work so that you say things that are false, though you don't know that they're false. You better really know your subject. And so there are a lot of different evangelicals who jumped onto the global warming bandwagon years ago, including the Evangelical Environmental Network and Arocha and Eden Vigil and so on, who say, well, if you care about the poor, if you love the poor, you have to try to fight against climate change. Now, that's just simply false. First, it's wrong morally in that it tries to play on people's guilt feelings rather than really showing a good case, okay? So that's a mistake. That's wrong. But second, it's wrong because, as we've already discussed, the conquest of poverty is far more important to human health and longevity than anything related to weather and climate. But the fixes to climate change, right, are all things that slow the conquest of poverty. And so I would say, properly speaking, that if we really love the poor around the world, if we really want to protect them from weather and climate disasters, whatever those might be, whenever, wherever, we want to see them stop being poor. And the cool thing about that is that, of course, that fixes all kinds of other problems, not just related to climate and weather, but that fixes problems related to disease. It fixes problems related to education, to safe transportation, to safe drinking water, and so on. So we should be championing the rise out of poverty of people all over the world rather than getting stuck in trying to fight climate change.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, government mandates often create corruption and cronyism as well. As I understand it, the UN has oftentimes used this climate change alarmism as like an opportunity to just redistribute wealth. Do you know anything about that? Is that accurate?
Sure. The Paris Climate Agreement, but climate agreements before that and after that, have all had provisions for reparation of the damages allegedly done by climate change driven by the use of fossil fuels in the wealthy countries around the world. They've all included these things, and the wealthy countries of the world have made pledges to put money into these funds. In fact, they've put next to nothing in. Nothing's really getting done on that, which is actually not a bad thing because the attempt to attribute X number of dollars worth of damage from this storm or from this cold snap or that heat wave or this flood, this drought, and so on. The attempt to attribute a certain strength of that storm or a certain number of dollars worth of damage done by it to increase in global average temperature due to the use of fossil fuels, okay, that's just simply absurd. It is impossible to do that. And therefore, it's absurd to try to require this redistribution of wealth from the already developed countries to the developing countries. And though they pledge to it, the developed countries aren't coming through and creating these trillion-dollar funds. So, there's a lot of talk. It's part of what you mentioned in the way of corruption. People will talk and make promises, but when it comes to going back home and asking the taxpayers for that money, they don't tend to get it.
So you mentioned climate guilt, and it sounds like is it fair to say that wealthy nations should not feel any sort of moral obligation to repay, quote unquote, developing nations because of historical emissions? Are they misunderstanding justice there?
Yeah, I think they're very badly misunderstanding it, just in terms of a very factual issue, and that is, has the harm brought to developing nations outweighed the benefits brought to developing nations from the fact that developed nations developed? All right? Right. And what you can do is you can look at the GDP per person for countries around the world and compare that with the amount of trade that they've had with developed nations around the world over the last century, century and a half, 2 centuries, okay? And what you find is that the more trade developing countries have had with developed countries, the higher is their GDP per capita. That means the wealthier their people are. And therefore, the better able they are to protect themselves from anything related to weather, climate, disease, any other kind of problem. So, if anything, the poorer nations should be saying thank you to the wealthier nations. Now, I'm not going to say, okay, you should be paying us some restitution for the costs that we've borne. After all, we were the ones who developed how to use coal cleanly. And that took a lot of time. It took a lot of expense in developing new technology. Shouldn't you have to pay us for that? No, I don't think so. But the truth is that the actual direction of the flow of wealth has been from the wealthier countries to the poorer countries, not the opposite. And partly precisely because the wealthier countries grew wealthier using fossil fuels.
All right, so on a more optimistic note, you often highlight the importance of human creativity. So what role does innovation play in solving environmental challenges? Where do you see the most promising breakthroughs, including how wind and solar fit into a future energy mix?
Okay. I might start out with this one. Back in the mid to late 19th century, a whole lot of lighting for indoors at night came from the use of whale oil. And as a result, we were decimating whale populations all around the world. At the time, there was some black sticky stuff that bubbled up out of the ground here and there. And it was really quite inconvenient. It was just a mess. But then some chemist figured out a way to turn that into kerosene to light lamps. And suddenly, the pressure on whale populations plunged, and they revived. Now, more chemists figured out more than 10,000 other ways to use that black, sticky stuff that bubbles up out of the ground and is a nuisance in its natural form. And from it, we get gasoline and diesel and all kinds of other products, including all the plastics that we use for anything from the headphones that you're wearing, Winter, to the plastic coatings on medications and tools. So what we have seen really is a tremendous improvement in human life because of technological innovation. And that comes from the fact that we're made in God's image. God, we learn from Genesis 1 through 26, that God started with nothing and he made everything. Well, we can't quite do that, but the better we get at making more and more out of less and less, the better we reflect the image of God. He started with darkness, which the Bible often uses as a metaphor for ignorance. He made light, which the Bible uses as a metaphor for knowledge or truth. The better we get at understanding God's world, the better we reflect his image. And the more we explain his world and through that disseminate more and more knowledge of God's world, the better we reflect God's image. He started with chaos and he made order. He started with no life and made life, made abundant variety of life, and told each variety to multiply and fill its niche in the world. So ultimately, of course, he makes mankind, male and female, to represent him and to rule over all of this. So at the Cornwall Alliance, we take Genesis 1:28, where we read that when God had created Adam and Eve, male and female, he blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth. We take that to mean, really, that reflecting God's image, we should be enhancing the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors, so that we're addressing the two great commandments, to love God and to love neighbor. And to do this, we need to be reconciled to God. People in rebellion against God are not going to understand his universe the way he made it. They're not going to use it the way he intends it, and therefore they are going to continue to suffer. So, therefore, the gospel comes in. The Great Commission to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that God has commanded. That Great Commission, then, is indispensable to the continued growth of our understanding of and proper use of God's world through the dominion mandate of Genesis 1:28. So we tie 1:28 and 28. Genesis 1:28, Matthew 28, to see how the Great Commission and the cultural mandate or dominion mandate work together.
Excellent. Are there any promising breakthroughs that you're aware of that are useful for energy sources and efficiency? Any market-driven solutions, things like that?
Well, AI is one of them, though it has its own dangers, as every technology has, after all. Any technological object can be misused. But AI is one of them because it greatly speeds our ability to put facts together and see how they relate to each other. We have to be very careful that we don't confuse its quantitative capacities with anything qualitative. AI can't do any qualitative reasoning whatsoever. Right. It is not intelligence. It is machine learning. So that would be one. There are some wonderful breakthroughs coming in nuclear technology, simplifying the technology of nuclear generating plants, making them less expensive to build, easier to maintain, less likely to have any kind of a dangerous failure. So those are happening. The fact that we're increasingly able now to use spent fuel as fuel to recycle radioactive fuel for nuclear reactors, that's great.
Yes.
I personally have had a lot of interest in small modular reactors, SMRs, but I recently spoke with a nuclear engineer friend of mine who said, no, Cal, those are a really cute idea, but in terms of scalability, they really will not supply vast amounts of energy. I mean, they're a great solution to little isolated spots where you can't bring electricity through a grid from a large plant. But in terms of the dollars per gigawatt hour of electricity generated, the SMRs will never compete with the 10 gigawatt plants and things like that. So, I was mistaken. But there are all kinds of interesting things coming about. Now, you asked about wind and solar. Through human history, we have been transitioning constantly from lower density sources of energy, primary energy sources, to higher density primary energy sources. We started out basically with carbohydrates, food, and that gave our bodies energy. And then with our bodies, we went out and hunted for more food, right? Well, carbohydrate is a very low density form of energy, primary energy. Little by little, we figured out how to use wood and then peat and then eventually coal. Now, coal, well, also along the way, we figured out how to use wind for some windmills to grind grain, for sails to move boats and things like that. But wind is very low density. It can be a bit higher than wood, can be a bit higher than food, but it's still fairly low density. Similarly, solar, we've been using that for a long time. After all, coal is batteries. Coal is solar energy sequestered in plants that then get buried and transformed into coal. So coal is batteries, it's solar energy. But that's another issue entirely and kind of fun to play with. But we get to coal, then to oil, then to natural gas, and then finally to the highest density form we've got so far is uranium for nuclear energy. A huge part of the cost of getting electricity out of your outlet in your house, right, is ramping up from the original density of your primary source to the density necessary for that electricity or for the fuel in your car or the fuel in your plane, whatever it is. That ramp up is a major part of the cost. Well, wind and solar are roughly a 300th to a 500th or even a 1,000th of the density of coal, oil, and natural gas. Which means that if you're trying to start from those, you're facing a major disadvantage to start with. Then, in addition, they are not truly clean energy sources. It takes a vast amount of mining of rare earths and other minerals to build and place wind turbines and solar panels. In fact, if you do a life cycle assessment, it turns out that when you've accounted for all of that mining, for all the refining of all of those minerals and the chemicals and so on, in the life cycle assessment, even coal, the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, is cleaner than wind and solar per gigawatt hour of electricity produced. So, I'm sorry, but aside from in small local situations where it is not economically cost effective to connect to a major grid, wind and solar are not good energy solutions.
All right. So let me just quickly say one of the cabinet members in the current administration I'm most excited about is Chris Wright, and he's championing natural gas through fracking and especially nuclear, which he has some experience with. And I feel that those would be wonderful candidates for zero emission energy. But the question I have for you, you can comment on that. But I wanted to say, just picking up on what you said about wind and solar, I know that certain places, countries and regions have tried this out. So I'm thinking of like Germany, Denmark, California, and Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada. I was wondering, do you know anything about how that's been working out for them, and especially from the point of view of consumer electricity prices and gas prices?
Yeah, mostly not well at all. The places that have the highest concentrations of wind and solar into their grids tend to have much higher energy prices, electricity prices, than those that don't. This is part of why Germany has lost a lot of its industrial base, because its industries have been moving to, believe it or not, the United States, because electricity is so much cheaper here than in Germany. California is facing the same problem. Now, that is not absolutely unavoidable. There's an interesting sort of exception to the rule here. Oklahoma has some of the lowest electricity prices in America, and it also has among the highest contributions of wind to its electric economy. Well, that has something to do with the particular weather patterns of Oklahoma. It's not part of what's called Tornado Alley for nothing. And so wind is a little more usable there in Oklahoma, but I think when you get down into the weeds and look carefully, a lot of the reason that it has the low electricity prices is that even though it has so much wind, it also has a huge amount of oil and natural gas, and those push the price down.
Yeah, my concern with wind and solar, one of the concerns is the things that you mentioned, also the unreliability of it in terms of consistency, but also the damage. I'm a big bird person, so I'm concerned about how those two in particular are very dangerous for birds and bats and tortoises and other marine life in case of wind. So I have concerns about those two in particular.
Yeah.
If you kill a golden eagle, you can go to jail and pay a great big fine. But if you are a wind a wind company, and you have a wind factory, not farm, these are not farms, you can get a permit to kill golden eagles, and you can kill hundreds of them and get away with it scot-free.
I don't like that.
I think really sad.
Yes,
yeah, it is. It is. Let's end on a kind of a quick note of maybe guidance and hope. Given the constant talk about climate alarmism, I hear a whole lot of it. I think we all hear a lot of it. If a young Christian came up to you and said, I'm worried about the environment, I know that we're in a lot of trouble. In fact, I don't even think I'm going to have kids. I'm not saving for the future. I know that, we're in a lot of trouble. If you had like 30 to 60 seconds, you're talking to someone who has a TikTok attention span, what would you tell him?
I would tell him first, if we fear the Lord, we need not fear anything else. And that's really important. When we fear the Lord, we respect him, we honor him, and then we don't think of his brilliantly designed and brilliantly sustained earth as susceptible to catastrophic warming from a minuscule change in atmospheric chemistry. CO2 going from 27 thousandths of a percent to 43 thousandths of a percent of the atmosphere. We start with the fear of the Lord. Then I would encourage him to get past headlines, to get past TikTok videos, and to really look into the solid scientific evidence, which is that while CO2 and other greenhouse gases do contribute to warming, the actual warming that comes from them is much less than what the computer climate models tell us. On average, they exceed the observed warming by anywhere from 2 to 4 times. And that warming is mostly in the winter, mostly toward the poles, mostly at night. So it raises very low temperatures, not toward the equator in the summer and the daytime. So it doesn't raise high temperatures. So it actually benefits us greatly. As you mentioned earlier, we have longer growing seasons, earlier last frost, later first frost. We also expand our growing regions into areas that used to be too cold. So in both latitude and altitude, we can grow things more. The result is more food for everybody. And by the way, just the CO2 by itself, I've already gone past the attention span, by the way. Just the
Our
CO2
audience is
itself. Just for the CO2 itself, that increases plant growth. All plants require CO2 for photosynthesis. And the NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, put out an estimate a few years ago that from 1990 to 2015, I think it was, added CO2 in the atmosphere all by itself had resulted in more vegetation on the Earth, equivalent to twice the vegetation in the entire 48 contiguous United States. That's a great thing. And what it means is more crop yields for everybody so that food is less expensive, the poor can eat better, but it also means more food for everything else that eats plants. which means that you slow species extinction because creatures are less vulnerable. Their habitats expand as plant ranges expand and so on. I'm sorry, I went beyond the 30 seconds, but I
love
can't
it.
help
I love
it. There's just so much good news here, and I would invite them to come to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Sign up for our free email newsletter, subscribe to our podcast, Created to Reign, read our blog. You can learn so many things. We're also on YouTube and on Facebook and on X, so we would welcome them.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop for today. So, Dr. Beisner, this has been an absolutely rich, clarifying conversation. Thank you so much for helping us think clearly and biblically about the environment, energy, and climate. So, listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, please consider helping us out by sharing this podcast with your friends, writing us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, subscribing and commenting on YouTube, and hitting the like button wherever you listen to this podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we'll see you again in the next one.